Hello and welcome to National 5 Biology Unit 2 KA6. So we're still on multicellular organism unit at the moment, and this is topic 6, transport systems in animals. Once again, here's the SQA course specification or mandatory knowledge section for this topic. This is all the bits of knowledge and content that you could be tested on in a test or an exam at this level for this topic. As you can see, this is a much larger topic than previous ones, so we're going to need to break this down into smaller sections so that we can understand it properly. As we go through the theory for each of the sections, there will be some questions after each part so that you can be sure that you're ready to move on. So the first part of transport systems that we're going to cover today in animals is the blood. So our learning intention for this part is to learn about the blood, and hopefully by the end of the lesson you'll be able to name the substances that are transported by the blood, describe the specialised structure of red blood cells and relate this to their function, and describe the two white blood cells and their functions as well. So in mammals like us, the blood contains three parts. The first part is the plasma, which is the liquid part of the blood, and it's this yellow part that you see down here. This is just a representation of what blood would look like if you separated out its component parts, with the liquid plasma sitting on top and the other two parts of the blood at the bottom. Suspended in mammalian blood, you'll also find two types of blood cells, red blood cells and white blood cells. So that's the three parts of the blood in mammals: plasma, red blood cells, white blood cells. So what's the function of the blood and why do mammals need it? Well, the blood transports three really important things that our body needs our cells to either gain or get rid of. And these are nutrients, oxygen, and carbon dioxide. Now we're going to focus on the two types of blood cells. So these two here, we don't really focus on plasma now, and we're going to look at these one after the other in more detail. So firstly, we're going to focus on red blood cells. So you need to know both the function of red blood cells and how they are specialised for that function. Remember when we talked about stem cells in a previous topic, we discussed specialisation. So how that cell is suited for its own particular function. For example, we talked about how sperm cells have a tail in order to be able to swim to and fertilise the egg, which is its function. When we talked about root hair cells and plants, we mentioned how their shape allowed them to have a larger surface area to absorb more water, as absorbing water was their function. So in terms of red blood cells, which is our focus today, the function of red blood cells is to transport oxygen around the body. And basically to do this, the red blood cells are specialised in three different ways. Firstly, they are what we call biconcave in shape. On the right-hand side here, you can see a red blood cell, and then the one below has been cut in half. You can see this characteristic shape here in this one that's been cut in half, and this is called biconcave shape. This allows the red blood cell to have a higher surface area so that it can bind to more oxygen. If this surface was just rectangular instead, it wouldn't have as large a surface area, so this is one way the red blood cell is specialised, through having its biconcave shape. Another way the red blood cell is specialised is it's the only cell in mammals that contains no nucleus. Now you might think this is silly, all animal cells contain a nucleus, don't they? That when we were back in cell structure, Area 1 of Unit 1, when we asked you to draw an animal cell, you would always draw it with a nucleus inside it. However, red blood cells have become specialised by having no nucleus, which again allows them to transport oxygen more efficiently. The reason they can transport oxygen more efficiently by having no nucleus is it means there is more space for the third thing. So hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is extremely important. Red blood cells cannot carry oxygen without it. It's the hemoglobin inside the red blood cells that binds to the oxygen and holds it so that the red blood cell can transport it around the body. When hemoglobin inside the red blood cells binds with oxygen, it forms a substance called oxyhemoglobin. And you can see this in the equation at the bottom of the slide here. This process would happen in the lungs, where the red blood cells pick up oxygen and blood becomes oxygenated, and we're going to come back to that in more detail later. Then the red blood cells travel around the body, and when they get to the tissues, groups of cells, remember, that need oxygen, they'll release the oxygen to them, and the oxyhemoglobin will go back to being hemoglobin inside the red blood cells, and it means that red blood cell is now ready to go and pick up some more oxygen again. This is shown in a different way in this diagram here. So you have hemoglobin binding with oxygen in the lungs to make oxyhemoglobin, and then at the tissues where oxygen is needed for respiration, oxyhemoglobin turns back into hemoglobin, releasing the oxygen, and then the red blood cells can go back to the lungs to pick up more. So let's try some quick questions on what we've covered so far to check our knowledge before we move on. So pause the video here and try these questions, either by saying the answer out loud or writing them down. And when you're ready, play the video and we will go through the answers. So the first question was, what are the three main components of the blood? Well, they are plasma, white blood cells, and red blood cells. The second question was, name two things the blood transports. So any two out of the three that I gave you on one of the previous slides. So nutrients, oxygen, and carbon dioxide. What is the function of red blood cells? Well, their function is to carry oxygen around the body in the form of oxyhemoglobin. And give three ways red blood cells are specialised for their function. They have a biconcave shape, they have no nucleus, and they contain hemoglobin. Okay, so now we're finished looking at red blood cells, we're now going to focus on white blood cells. Whilst the function of red blood cells is to transport oxygen around the body, the role of white blood cells is that they are part of the immune system and they are involved in destroying pathogens. Now, you should definitely always use this word pathogens when talking about white blood cells, and you must know the definition. So a pathogen is a disease-causing microorganism. Microorganism means they are microscopic or very small. There are three categories of disease-causing microorganisms that they fall into. So these are bacteria, viruses, and fungi. So white blood cells are part of the immune system and destroy any disease-causing bacteria, viruses, or fungi that get in, and these are referred to as pathogens. White blood cells themselves can also be split further into two main types. There are phagocytes and there are lymphocytes, and you need to know the differences between these two. So phagocytes are the first type of white blood cell that we're going to look at. Their role is to carry out a process called phagocytosis. So phagocytes carry out phagocytosis. This process involves engulfing and then digesting pathogens, those disease-causing bacteria, viruses, or fungi that I mentioned before. To get a mark for describing the function of phagocytes or the role of phagocytosis, you must say both engulf and digest. Saying destroy is not enough. The diagram at the bottom of the slide here shows the process of phagocytosis taking place. You can see the phagocyte here, and here's the pathogen, so the disease-causing microorganism, which could be either a virus, bacteria, or fungi. The phagocyte firstly engulfs the pathogen. You can see the cell membrane and the cytoplasm of the phagocyte starting to surround the pathogen here, but you can just say engulf, that's enough. And then once it's engulfed the pathogen, it then digests it and breaks it down. Now, this process is non-specific. Phagocytes will phagocytose any foreign pathogens they come across. So whether this is a bacteria, virus, or fungi, any different type of those, the phagocyte doesn't care. It will be able to engulf and digest this. It doesn't mind what type it is. This is quite different from our next type of white blood cell, which is very specific. So our second type of white blood cell are lymphocytes. Some lymphocytes produce molecules called antibodies which destroy pathogens. That's their function. Lymphocytes do not engulf and digest like phagocytes do. Instead, they produce these antibodies, like these ones here, that bind to the pathogen and destroy it. And you can see that in this diagram. You also need to know that each antibody is specific to a particular pathogen. You can see that this pathogen on the left-hand side has triangular shapes on its surface. At this stage, you do not need to know what these are, but these will only bind with the antibody on the left. If we look at these two antibody shapes, only this one will bind to this pathogen. So this antibody is specific to this particular pathogen. In contrast, this antibody on the right would not bind to that pathogen as its shape is not specific to it. Instead, this antibody would bind with this pathogen here. So overall, you need to know there are two types of white blood cells, phagocytes and lymphocytes. Phagocytes are not specific and engulf and digest pathogens through phagocytosis, whereas lymphocytes produce antibodies to destroy pathogens, and these antibodies are specific to a particular pathogen, like you can see in this diagram here. Please notice how in all of my definitions, explanations, and examples, I've used the word pathogen. Please make sure you use this word and not words like germ or bugs, or just even saying viruses, bacteria, or fungi by themselves, as not all viruses, bacteria, or fungi are pathogens. Remember, pathogens are disease-causing microorganisms. Not all viruses, bacteria, and fungi actually cause disease. So let's try some quick questions on what we've covered so far to check our knowledge before we move on. Again, pause the video here and try these questions, either by saying the answer out loud or by writing them down. And when you're ready, play the video and we will go through the answers. Okay, so the first question was, what is the function of white blood cells? Their function is to destroy pathogens. The second question was, what are the two types of white blood cells? They are phagocytes and lymphocytes. Question 3 asks, out of those two, which one is specific? Lymphocytes are specific because they produce those antibodies that are specific to particular pathogens. Describe how each one of these white blood cells works. Well, phagocytes carry out phagocytosis by both engulfing and digesting pathogens, whereas lymphocytes produce antibodies which destroy pathogens, and each antibody is specific to a particular pathogen. Okay, so now we've covered the blood as a transport system in animals, we are now going to move on to looking at the heart. So our learning intention is to learn about the heart, and hopefully by the end of this section, you'll be able to label the valves, veins, arteries, and flow of blood on the heart diagram, and explain the functions of the different parts of the heart and associated blood vessels as well. So firstly, we need to know about the difference between oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, and it's actually in the name. So oxygenated blood contains a high concentration of oxygen in it, whereas deoxygenated blood contains a low concentration of oxygen. One thing I want to point out here is that in most diagrams you will see in textbooks online, and in these slides I'm going to use as well, oxygenated blood is usually coloured in red and deoxygenated blood is coloured in blue. Now, this is not the case in real life. This is just a way to help you visualise the difference between them, and we keep it consistent between all of these things to try and help. So please don't think that the blood going through your body that's deoxygenated is blue. That's actually a myth. So before we get into detail about the heart itself, you need to know the pathway of blood in the body. Here on the right-hand side is a basic diagram that I'll be using in all of the following slides about the heart, and we are going to build on this until we have everything you need to know. When I draw this diagram to try and help me remember the heart and the pathway of blood, I always put the heart in the middle, the lungs above it, and the body below it. So this is the first thing you should draw if you're wanting to use this diagram to help you, which I suggest you do. Then once I've written lungs, heart, and body in that order, I then fill in the pathway of oxygenated blood in red and deoxygenated blood in blue. But you can choose any two colours as long as you keep it consistent. If we think about it logically, the blood picks up oxygen in the lungs. So when basically the deoxygenated blood goes to the lungs to pick up oxygen, the oxygenated blood then leaves the lungs and it must go back to the heart. Then it can be pumped out to the body. As we discussed earlier, as the body tissues use oxygen, the oxygen gets lost from the blood, so the tissues can use them for respiration. And so the blood that comes back from the body to the heart has a lower concentration of oxygen, and we describe it as deoxygenated. Then the heart pumps this deoxygenated blood back to the lungs, where it can pick up more oxygen and begin this cycle again. So what you'll find is this side of the heart always has deoxygenated blood, this side of the heart always has oxygenated blood. Here's a bigger version of this diagram. So just to go through one more time, so we've definitely got this before we go into more difficult stuff. So the deoxygenated blood goes from the body to the heart, then from the heart to the lungs, where it picks up oxygen, becoming oxygenated, and this oxygenated blood comes back to the heart before being pumped out to the body. Essentially, the blood must return to the heart in the middle anytime it passes between the lungs and the body. It can't go straight from the body to the lungs. It's got to go to the heart first, then go to the lungs, and then when it comes back, again, it has to go to the heart first and then to the body. So now we're going to briefly focus in on the heart itself. The heart is a muscle made up of 4 chambers. The chambers are the 4 central parts of the heart itself. The 2 chambers at the top are called the atria, and the 2 at the bottom are called ventricles. Now you'll see that I've said atria here and atrium over here. Atria is plural, so if you're talking about just one, you talk about atrium. If you're talking about both, you talk about atria. The way I remember that the atrium is at the top, or the atria are at the top, is they start with an A, which is the start of the alphabet, so they go at the top, whereas ventricles is near the end of the alphabet, so they go at the bottom. There are also two sides to the heart, the right side and the left side. Now, you might be looking at this diagram and thinking that I've made a mistake, but I assure you I haven't. When drawing or labeling a heart on paper, the sides are actually reversed. So the left-hand side of the paper is the right-hand side of the heart, and the right is the left. So just remember, it's the reverse of what you think. If you're looking at the bit of paper and you're looking at the left-hand side of the paper, that is the right-hand side of the heart, and if you're looking at the right, it's the left. So on the left side at the top is the right atrium, and then below that is the right ventricle. And then over here we have the left atrium and the left ventricle. Now, all I've done in this slide is combine the last two slides together. So where I've just written the heart in the middle previously, I now have the four chambers, and I've just shortened them down to right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. So when I draw this out normally, I usually just shorten, abbreviate the names of these so I don't have to write them out each time. Now, one very important thing to point out here is that blood always goes into the atria first. No matter whether it's coming from the lungs or the body, it will go to the atria and then to the ventricle. So here you can see from the body, the deoxygenated blood has come into the heart, into the right-hand side of the heart, first into the right atrium, and then down into the right ventricle. And then the blood leaves from the ventricle and goes to the lungs. So blood always goes into the atria and out of the ventricles. It's the same on the other side of the heart. The oxygenated blood comes back to the heart from the lungs, first goes into the left atrium, then moves down into the left ventricle, and then moves out of the left ventricle to the body. At this point, I would suggest pausing the video and going back if you're unsure or want to practice memorising any of the information on this slide, as there's quite a lot of new information on the next few slides and you'll need to feel confident with this knowledge before moving on. So you also need to know the names of the blood vessels that are associated with the heart. There are four main ones we're going to add to this diagram. These are the blood vessels that either carry blood into the atria on either side or out of the ventricles on either side. And there are simple ways to remember their names and add them to your diagram, which we're going to talk about now. So the first rule for labeling the blood vessels on your diagram is that any blood vessels to do with the lungs start with the word pulmonary. For example, you may have heard before about pulmonary embolisms or pulmonary bypasses. These are both to do with the lungs too. So on the diagram, you can now see in the highlighted sections that I've added the word pulmonary on each side at the top, as these blood vessels on each side carry blood either to the lungs or back from the lungs to the heart. So this one on this side carries blood away from the heart to the lungs, and this one carries oxygenated blood back to the heart from the lungs. So both of them are pulmonary. The second rule you need to remember is that vessels that take blood away from the heart are called arteries. Remember this as they both start with A. Arteries, away. So on my diagram, you can now see that I've looked for the two vessels that move blood away from my heart, the two arrows that go away. So one goes away from the heart towards the lungs, which is this one here. So I've added the word artery over here. And the other one comes from away from the heart to the body. So I've added the word artery over here as well. And we're going to discuss this one soon, but for now, we're just going to write artery beside it. So I can tell that this one is now the pulmonary artery. Okay, so pulmonary artery because it's to do with the lungs and it's carrying blood away from the heart. The third rule is that the vessels that take blood back towards the heart are called veins. So the other two vessels I didn't label in the last diagram, I can now put vein next to. This means that this vessel here is the pulmonary vein because it's to do with the lungs, so it's pulmonary, and vein as it's taking blood back towards the heart. I can also say that this vessel down here is a vein as well, as it's taking blood back towards the heart from the body. And again, we'll talk about this one in more detail on the next slide. The final rule regarding these two vessels at the bottom, so the two vessels that go between the heart and the body, have fancy names which start with the first letter of their blood vessel. So this one over here was a vein and it starts with a V, so it is the vena cava. This vessel over here was an artery, so it starts with an A, and this is the aorta. So it's taking blood away from the heart. So artery, aorta, vena cava is a vein, and it's because they're to do with the body. So we're not pulmonary because they're not to do with the lungs, they're to do with the body. So you remember they are the fancier names for these two. Okay, so that is my tips on how to draw a diagram of the heart and pathway of blood in the body. You need to be able to label all of this in an exam. You should definitely know it off by heart so that you can draw it beside more difficult diagrams of the heart to help you. I know there'll be other ways to memorise diagrams similar to this, but I hope those last few slides gave you an idea of the way that you could do it. And please feel free to go back through that few minutes again if you think it'd be useful before moving on to harder questions. You could also try and pause the video here and try and draw from memory this diagram again so that you know that you're definitely ready to move on. So as I mentioned, in an exam, heart diagrams do not look as simple as our diagram from before. This diagram here is a more realistic drawing of a heart. And in exams, the diagrams often are simplified down to this, but not much further. You must be able to identify and label the parts of the heart from these diagrams, including the 4 chambers. So the 4 chambers are here, 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 and here. And on this diagram, here, 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 and here. Okay, so you have to be able to overlay what we learned about in that last diagram onto this one here. And you also have to be able to work out what the names of the 4 blood vessels are. So this is a blood vessel, this one, and the same on this diagram over here. I think the easiest way to do this is to memorise the diagram I showed previously and then draw this on the paper next to the heart diagram so that you can then compare them easily. You can do that in any test or any exam. One tip to point out here is that it looks like there are more than 4 blood vessels coming out of this version of the heart. This is because some of them split outside of the heart. So this is one vessel, these 2 parts here, but they come into one bit. So this is one vessel, but even though it's split into 2 at this point. And this one up here might look like it has 2 parts at the top, but again, it's just one. So here I'll explain and walk you through the passage of blood through this more detailed heart, and I've put the more simplified diagram that I've asked you to learn and draw beside it so that you can see how useful it can be. So if we start with the heart chamber, so the heart was this bit here, and I think about it in terms of this, we can work out which are the atria and which are the ventricles. So this is the right atrium, this is the right ventricle, this is the left atrium, and this is the left ventricle. So if we start with the chambers and we go through them, the blood comes into the atrium, then goes down into the right ventricle, and then on the other side, blood would come into the left atrium and go down to the left ventricle. Now, if we focus on the vessels from the body coming into the right atrium, so body into right atrium is the vena cava. So that means the right atrium, these are the vessels coming in here. So this and this is both the vena cava. Okay, so if I look at my more complex diagram, you can see this is the vena cava. So blood will come into the right atrium here from the vena cava here, and then go down into the right ventricle. Where most people now trip up is finding the next vessel, which is the pulmonary artery. So up here, we can see it goes from the right atrium to right ventricle and then goes out via the pulmonary artery to the lungs. So where's the pulmonary artery in this diagram? Well, the blood comes from the right atrium into the right ventricle, and then it goes up through this part here. Okay, this bit in the middle. So this is the pulmonary artery here. Okay. And basically it goes up, so from the ventricle, blood goes up and out through the vessel in the middle of the heart. So this vessel here would be the pulmonary artery. The pulmonary artery takes the blood away to the lungs, and then when it comes back to the heart, it's through the pulmonary vein into the left atrium. So if I go to the left atrium, then it means that this must be the pulmonary vein that's bringing blood in here. Okay. So pulmonary vein brings blood into the left atrium of the heart, which is W here, and then basically the blood goes down from the atrium into the ventricle like we discussed before, and then it has to leave the ventricle through the aorta to the body. So the aorta would be, if it goes down here, it's really hard to see because it's actually behind this part here, but this is the aorta behind that goes up and out to the body. So basically always think that blood goes from the atrium to the ventricle and then goes out of one of these passages through the middle of the heart. So hopefully you can see how drawing the simple diagram next to the more complex one allows you to be able to label any of the parts quite easily. Even I would struggle if this diagram wasn't here to be able to label all of the parts. So what you should always do when you go into a test or exam is draw this out first, and then it means you can use it to help you label the parts. The next thing you need to be able to point out in the location of a diagram is the valves. So there are 4 valves in the heart, and they all have the same very important role. They prevent backflow of blood. You need to know this definition. On a diagram of the heart, 2 of the valves are found between the atria and ventricles on each side. So a valve basically looks like a wee upside down V shape where the middle at the bottom doesn't meet. So this is one of the valves here between the right atrium and right ventricle. And this is another valve here between the left atrium and left ventricle. So this basically prevents blood from going back the way. So if blood comes into the left atrium and goes down through this here, if the blood tried to go back the way, this would close and it would prevent the backflow of blood, because you don't want the blood to mix or go back the way. You want it to go in one direction. The other 2, so 2 of the valves are between the atriums and ventricles on either side. The other 2 are found at the entrance to the arteries leaving the heart. So again, here you can see another valve here and another valve here. So in both of the arteries that go away from the heart, so the pulmonary artery and the aorta, both of these contain a valve right at the start. So the valves basically go across the centre of the heart here. You have the 2 between the atriums and ventricles, and 2 of them that are at the start of the arteries leaving the heart. You do not need to know the names of these. So if you see anything online about tricuspid and bicuspid valves, you don't need to know those names, so don't worry. You also need to know about one more type of blood vessel that's associated with the heart, and this is called the coronary artery. You can see the coronary artery here going over the top of the heart. If they want you to label it, the heart would have to look like this one, as you can't see the coronary artery on any of the other diagrams I've shown you. If I go back here, you can't see the coronary artery on this diagram. The function of the coronary artery is that it supplies the heart with oxygenated blood. Remember, the heart is a muscle, and this is made up of lots of cells that all need nutrients and oxygen, as well as be able to work properly, so they can work properly. So the coronary artery is the artery that supplies the heart itself with the oxygenated blood that it needs to continue to work. So if you were to go through the diagrams from earlier of the pathway of blood and write down each part in order, it would give you this cycle here. This, or the simple diagram from earlier, will help you to explain the function of each part of the heart. This type of question is less common than needing to identify or label the parts of the heart, but there's an easy way to answer it if it does come up. So here at the top is a specific way to structure your answer if you get asked to describe the function of one of the associated blood vessels. Each part that's highlighted needs to be fixed by you to fit whatever vessel it asks about in the question. For example, if I asked you to use this structure to describe the function of the pulmonary artery, you would say it's an artery that carries deoxygenated blood from the heart to the lungs. And you can see this in the diagram down here. So if I've asked about the pulmonary artery, it's an artery that carries blood, deoxygenated blood, because it's blue, from the heart to the lungs. So again, you can use your diagram to help you. Now, out loud, use the structure at the top that I've left up here to help you to see the function of the pulmonary vein. So pause the video here and try and play again when you're ready for the answer. You can use the diagram to help you. So you should have said that the pulmonary vein is a vein that carries oxygenated blood from the lungs to the heart. Now do the same thing for the vena cava. Pause the video here and try and play again when you're ready for the answer once you've said it out loud. So for this one, you should have said that the vena cava is a vein that carries deoxygenated blood from the body to the heart. Finally, do the same thing but for the aorta. Pause the video here and try and play again when you've said the answer out loud. So the function of the aorta, if you look over here, is it's an artery that carries oxygenated blood from the heart to the body. Finally, the only 2 parts of the heart that you can't use the previous sentence structure for are the atria and ventricles. You need to know the function of the atria is that they are the upper chambers of the heart that pass blood to the lower ventricles. And for the ventricles, you need to know they are the lower chambers of the heart that receive blood from the upper atria. So let's try some quick questions on what we've covered so far about the heart to check our knowledge before we move on. So pause the video here and try these questions either by saying the answer out loud or writing them down. And when you're ready, play the video and we will go through the answers. Okay, so the first question asks you to name the 4 chambers of the heart. They are the right atrium, right ventricle, and left ventricle. The second question asked what word can be used to describe the blood that comes to the heart from the body. So it comes to the heart from the body, so those cells would have used the oxygen that was in the blood for respiration, so that must be deoxygenated blood. What is the name of the vessel that carries the blood from the heart to the body? Right, so it's going from the heart to the body, so that's away from the heart, so it must be an artery, so it must start with an A, and it's going to the body, so it's the fancier name. So for this one, it would be the aorta. And what is the name of the vessel that carries blood from the heart to the lungs? Okay, so the way I think through this is it's going to the lungs, so it has to be pulmonary. And if it's going away from the heart to the lungs, then it means it's going to have to be an artery as well. So it's the pulmonary artery. So now that we've covered the heart as a transport system in animals, we are now going to move on to look at our final transport system, which is the blood vessels in more detail. So our learning intention for this part of the lesson is to learn about blood vessels, and hopefully by the end of the lesson, you'll be able to identify the 3 types of blood vessels, describe the function of the different types of blood vessels, and compare the blood vessels to one another as well. So there are 3 types of blood vessels that you need to be able to identify, describe, and compare to one another in National 5. There are arteries, veins, and capillaries. Now, what I'd like you to do is to pause the video here and using these pictures only, try and work out some of the differences between each. So you want to think about, are there differences between the wall that goes around the outside, so this bit in dark pink, and is there a difference between the central channel in each one, the bit that goes through the middle as well? So pause the video here, try and work out some of the differences, and we'll discuss each as we go through the next few slides. So the first blood vessel we're going to look at is arteries. Now, we already mentioned arteries when we spoke about the heart, and you already know that they carry blood away from the heart, so arteries and away. If we look at the diagram here, where the artery's been cut in half, you can see they have very thick muscular walls. If I can go back, you can see that this is especially thick compared to veins, and the capillaries don't seem to have any at all. So this is really thick compared to the veins because the arteries carry blood under high pressure away from the heart. So under high pressure, they carry the blood, and each time the heart pumps the blood, the artery walls have to be thick enough to withstand the high pressure without breaking. Additionally, because so much of the space is taken up with the thick muscular walls, the central channel, so the bit in the middle, if we look compared to the veins, is a lot narrower. And that's because there is more muscular wall around the outside, so a narrower central channel that carries that blood under high pressure away from the heart. In comparison, veins have thinner walls. So if we look at this picture here, the walls are thinner than the ones in the arteries, and they also have a wider central channel as well. You've noticed that I've underlined the in thinner walls and wider central channel, and that's because you need to directly compare veins to arteries. You can't just say they have thin walls, they have thinner walls than arteries, and they have a wider central channel. These are both because it carries blood back towards the heart, like we talked about before when we were discussing the veins and the heart. And this means that they carry blood under low pressure, so they don't need to have such thick walls. Additionally, you need to know that veins are the only ones of these 3 vessels that contain valves. So remember this because valves start with a V, and so do veins, and we know from before that valves prevent the backflow of blood. So now that we've discussed arteries and veins, we need to look at our third blood vessel type, which we haven't talked about before. Before we do this though, I would suggest that if you are ever given the choice to choose 2 blood vessels to compare, always choose arteries and veins, as they are much easier to directly compare than either of them with a capillary. So here in this diagram, you can see the artery carrying blood away from the heart at high pressure with its thick muscular walls and narrower central channel. The blood then goes through the capillaries to the vein, which carries blood back towards the heart under low pressure with its thinner walls and wider central channel. And you can also see a valve here as well, because remember, valves are only found inside the veins and inside the heart as well. So now what we're going to do is we're going to focus on capillaries. So capillaries are found between arteries and veins, and they form networks at tissues and organs to allow efficient exchange of materials, such as oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nutrients. So here you can see the network they form. They're not just one single long tube, they have a network that goes through each of these cells within the tissue. They have very, very thin walls, and this is because as they form between cells, or they go between cells, that you can see in this diagram, materials have to be able to diffuse into and out of the capillary vessels to the surrounding cells. Now, when we talked about diffusion before, we talked about the fact that there has to be very, very thin cell membranes or walls or ways for those materials to diffuse through from a high to low concentration. So if the walls were any thicker than this wouldn't happen. They also have a large surface area to be able to help them efficiently exchange these materials. So let's try some quick questions on what we've covered so far to check our knowledge before we move on. So pause the video here and try these questions, either by saying the answer out loud or by writing them down. And when you're ready, play the video and we will go through the answers. So the first question was, what are the three types of blood vessel? They are arteries, capillaries, and veins. The second question was, what vessels do you find valves in and what is their function? So we find valves in veins, remember that V, valves, V for veins, and their function is to prevent backflow of blood. The third question was, which blood vessel has the thinnest walls and why? So the one that has the thinnest walls are capillaries, and the reason they have the thinnest walls is to allow efficient exchange of materials. Don't just say it allows them to exchange or let oxygen diffusion or carbon dioxide diffuse out. You need to try and use that phrase, efficient exchange of materials. Okay, so that's us finished learning about transport systems in animals. I hope you're now confident about how the blood vessels, and heart allow transport of these important substances in mammals. This was a very, very large topic, so do please feel free to go back and watch parts of the video again in the future if you need a refresher on any of the parts of this topic. Thank you once again for listening.